Well, Paul, that was amazing. It, I'll say, I don't know if others on the session today feel like this, but I sort of thought after 30 odd years in this business, I knew something, and I'm figuring maybe I don't know anything. And I've never portrayed myself as a restoration expert by any means, but I think I really appreciate the walkthrough you and the other panelists have given us today on this way of thinking. I would say some of it I thought, oh yeah, I think I knew that, but following it all the way through has been quite revealing and informative to me. So, we do have some time for some questions at the end of our day here. I'm going to go to the first one on the Slido. It's been up there for a while, but I do think it follows Paul's talk. And Paul, I think you touched on this or even covered it in your talk, but maybe you can just sharpen the commentary on this. It's that it was interesting that the restoration of the channel in Oregon started at the bottom. It's counterintuitive to me. I would have thought it would start at the top in order not to have channelized areas transfer energy downstream and again in size of restored areas. So would you like to respond to
Yeah,
that?
no, that's spot on. And I think absolutely everything about these projects is 180 reverse of what we used to think about. So maybe that's why I like it so much. I'm a little goofy that way. But really, it comes down to that geomorphic control. If you think about the long-term evolution of this valley, how it formed in the first place and why it developed, it starts with that geomorphic control. And so if we can reestablish that, then the rest is easy. Now we're swimming with the current, and we're using all the things that Jared and Damien shared with us, getting the river to work for us, getting those processes to work in our advantage. So that river is continuing to bring us sediment and, say, the Bella Coola, a whole lot of it, right? And so if you can reestablish that geomorphic control so that it's no longer efficient at transporting out that sediment, that was the lowest gradient. Always the downstream end is going to be the lowest gradient. Now we can start accreting sediments and backing up. And every year it's hitting those deposits and accreting further and further and further upstream. Versus if you did the opposite, if you start at the top and catch elevations there first, now you'll remember on our profile, your water surface is almost 1.9 meters below the geomorphic grade line. So now you've got a tremendous amount of hydraulic head that you need to overcome just to re-wet those surfaces. So you've put a tremendous amount of stress on those features, and you're not going to recharge that alluvial aquifer. That's still being controlled by your loss of the geomorphic control. Versus if you reverse that, now you can start to charge that groundwater as well, start to grow the riparian forest, and everything just starts to snowball.
I think I'm getting it. But thanks for that. Would any of the other panelists like to just comment any further on that? If not, I'll flip it over to Dale for the next question.
Okay, I'll go to the next question. Let's see. Most examples for stage 0 projects provided so far have been for incised channels, which makes sense because that's what the topic was today. But I guess the question is, would a stage 0 approach be suitable for other channel types? Lots of room. Go ahead, Colin. Lots of room for interpretation on that question.
Well, before we thought of the term stage 0, back in 2009, there was a flood alleviation scheme in the town of Forres in Scotland that I think was ahead of the curve. The burn of Mossett ran right through the centre of the city, it still does, and flooded it frequently. And so the scheme involved storing floodwater upstream of the town in what was an old glacial lake bed and turning it back into a lake. To do that, what we did was breached the embankments on the burn of Mossett, which was in fact perched above its old floodplain because sediment accumulation had been concentrated between the flood embankments. And so all that we needed to do there was put breaches in the embankments at the appropriate spots so that the water could reactivate the floodplain and not flood the town. So that's a case where the stream was not incised; it was actually hanging or graded or perched, whichever way you want to put it. So I think, yeah, Reconnecting floodplains that are disconnected for either reason is a good idea. And honestly, like Janine was saying, you know, don't necessarily make reference to stage zero. Some people really don't like that concept or that term, and have sort of tried to degrade it by saying, oh, actually, it's ground zero you're talking about. If you don't like the idea of stage zero or a pre-Anthropocene condition, then just call it something else. Call it by its name, which is fully reconnecting floodplains, fully rehydrating floodplains. And you can't do that everywhere, but if you can do it, you'll probably get the biggest ecological return on your investment.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Jason, over to you for the next question.
Janine, I'll give you a heads up. I'd like to come back to something that I asked you in your presentation, and it was on, I think I've got the slide up here while I look at my computer. It was your slide 16. Yeah, this one. Thank you, Amy. And I get the idea that you were trying this project was raising the elevation of the bed to reconnect to the floodplain. But I still don't know how you did that. Can you just give, even at a high level, what does that mean? Is it just dump trucks and dirt, or what is it exactly that makes this happen?
Yes, I can. I'll do my best with words. What I've learned today is that I should have a few more slides in here showing some of the pictures. I often used 5 Mile Bell as an example. So yeah, essentially what happened in this project, and Paul can help me out here, is going in, there was some berms and so forth, taking material and completely filling that channel. This was one of, I would say for many people, the more shocking projects, because everything that you see, all the green in that picture, in that kind of flat area, is reed canary grass, which was invasive and is a monoculture. And so they stripped back all of that mat of reed canary grass, exposed all this fine sediment, and completely filled in that ditch and let the water go. And as Colin mentioned earlier, this is one of the projects where they actually cut some small channels, pilot channels, that eventually kind of got filled in. And now when you go out there, and actually we're talking to a colleague of ours yesterday who was out there this week, and there's water all over that floodplain. Now, this is low in the system. It goes into a lake. So that flat surface that you see is essentially underwater for months at a time and is a huge coho producer. So a very successful project that's being monitored. Vegetation recovery has been good. It essentially uncovered the seed bank. So we had a lot of native vegetation come back. But I really wish I had those slides for you right now, because I would love to show you what that looked like, stripping off all of the grass and completely filling in that ditch. So Paul, is there anything else you'd like to add to that description?
No, I think that's very good. And it kind of speaks to the next question I saw there on the screen about invasive weeds too. Yeah, there's still some canary grass in there, but now it's, 3% instead of 100. So massive win there. And this project, Colin mentioned in his presentation, it's been implemented over many phases, and it's really fun to walk it and see that evolution that kind of mimics exactly what Janine shared in her presentation this morning. The downstream end was the first phase, and that fish passage and keeping the current channel was extremely important to everybody. So all that was done was we cut off the confining levees on Valley Left. The next phase was, okay, now we're not so happy with that. We saw, again, a happy accident where flows went over the left bank, started to create more features, and people freaked out. It was a big deal for a lot of people, but within a week or something, it's like, the willows just start to carpet bomb everything, and you walk in it, and every step you take, it's full of juvenile coho. So it's magical. And so they're like, well, why don't we try to do this deliberately on the next phase? And like Janine said, then the thought is, okay, we want anti-branching channels. We want it distributed. So they manually constructed a whole bunch of these channels, and it took them a lot of time and a lot of effort. And like she showed with that Karnowski example, those very quickly filled in with sediment and made their own. And so they quickly realized, well, we spent a tremendous amount of time building these and they've been erased instantly. And so for what? Why don't we just scrape it, get rid of the canary grass, fill in the ditch entirely on the next phase and let it do what it's going to do? And so there's just really beautiful photos showing that progression and how the different phases have responded. And it's a really, really nice example.
So can I just ask a follow-up question to this? Is this project a unicorn? Like it's a 1 in a million and it's a great story and we all just want to run back to our little home village and do this? Or is this a reality that can be replicated with reasonable frequency based on the way we have occupied floodplains?
Yes, very much. It can be replicated.
Yes,
Sorry, Janine,
it
you
is
go.
not a unicorn. It's definitely not a unicorn. It is a really great example. But when we talk about Karnowski Creek, we talked about Bailey Creek, any of these low gradient systems and a lot of our coastal systems, it is possible there. And the kind of neat thing about 5 Mile Bell is it's a sand bedded system. So it's a finer grain system. And that was one of the questions, like, well, you can do this in a gravel bed system, but can you do it in these finer soils that are super erodible? And the answer is yes, we can. It's not a unicorn. And I am going to turn my camera off for a few minutes. I'm going to see if I can find a few slides to quickly send over, if I can get them to you before our time is up today.
All right, well, thanks, Paul and Janine, for that. I'll maybe flip back to Dale if you want to go back to.
Yeah, sure. Go back to the questions. I think we answered the one around invasive species for the most part, but let's go to the next one. Paula, I guess it's more of a technical question directed to you, and if I can sum it up, I guess, what are the key assumptions or decision points that you need to consider when you're drawing the center line for doing an REM target?
So the actual center line, drawing it, left to right within the valley, not that critical. You basically just don't want to follow a valley or follow the channel, excuse me. When I see mistakes made when people are doing it are on their own is not understanding where those upstream and downstream boundaries are, where the hinge point for the next depositional valley is, for example. So what I've seen people do a lot of times is they'll draw that center line through the extent of the property ownership, for example. And so while that makes sense for them, and as far as developing their project, they're only going to work on that one given property, it leaves them hanging without understanding the broader context for this river. You have to know where that geomorphic control is and then build your project all the way down and tying into that. Otherwise, you're going to leave your system perched or super vulnerable to just simply head cutting itself again. So I'd say that's the most important part, is knowing where that geomorphic control is and tying back into it. And sometimes it's a geological feature. Sometimes if you're working on a tributary, it's where it flows into the larger trunk river system. So they're all different, but you need to know where that is and how to tie into it.
Thank you very much. Jason?
All right, the next question, it looks like one's kind of leaping up to the top of our Slido board. What would be your typical strategy to improve floodplain connectivity where the cause of incision has not been at a point location? For example, where it is due to increased peak flows from logging or other climate change effects interacting with the land base. And if you can answer that in like 3 sentences so we can just get on with it, that would be perfect.
Let's say space. give the system some space. Because I think that is the kind of a take home of all of these projects. So what I'm showing in the REM is what the river was at the time of death, when that incision occurred and left behind everything else, right? And we're trying to get elevations back to reconnect that valley, but that's not the future. Our future is going to have a different climate. We're going to have different sediment delivery mechanisms. We've got the highway. Our precipitation's changing. So what we're trying to do is connect the valley so it can adjust and adapt to whatever the future brings to the best of its abilities. And that's all we can give it.
But Paul, does that mean that, if I'm understanding it properly, that it doesn't really matter whether it was because of some berms and levees or if it's because of more upland land use change? The idea of reconnecting the floodplain can still work, and it's still essentially the same mechanism. Understand what your elevation control point is, and tie to that and build back from there, regardless of what the cause might be. Is that what you're saying?
Right. And so Colin showed the Dorothy Merritt's example out of the Northeast, and it very much followed exactly what you're describing. They were clear cutting in the Northeast and tremendous amounts of sediment delivery. But on top of that, there was low head dams, tens of thousands of them across all these valleys with water wheels. So they were generating energy off of stream flow. So those dams all filled in with sediment. Then the dams go away, and then the rivers cut back through those sediments. And so that's what created those banks that people were observing in later years. So yes, that those sediment deliveries may be higher and increased from land use practices. But again, if taken off, if say we don't have dams and such that are filling up with sediments and then going to be removed, again, if we can distribute those inputs across the full extent of the valley rather than focusing it into a constricted channel, it's going to have its best ability to deal with those and distribute those impacts over a broader area. Dr. Thorne, I'm sure, can speak more intelligently to that.
Well, maybe before
No. That was fine. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe before you jump in, Colin, I'll ask a very simple question, and you can talk down to me and explain it. And maybe it's Damien too that will jump in and so just listening to this conversation made me think about the one of the premises of process-based restoration, addressing the root causes. And here we're talking about working really downstream and not so much focusing on perhaps some of the root causes that might be upstream in the broader watershed. And so help me marry those two together.
Well, I mean, in terms of responding to what locally I've learned is called hydromodification, which is a big thing in the realms I'm working here in Washington and Oregon. That catchments have been paved over, developments have gone in, and stormwater runoff has been exacerbated, and and streams have suffered as a result of it, downstream streams. So what do we do about that? Do we try and treat the streams, or do we try and treat the source areas? And the answer is, well, we do both. We're going to need to do both. And so the upstream causes are dealt with or addressed through things like green streets and bioswales and green roofs and blue roofs, and yes, storage vaults and tanks. We use all the tools in the toolbox to try and reduce that hydromodification. But what we find very frequently is you can't do enough. And so you also then address the streams that are at the lower end of this to increase their capacity to adapt and accommodate a wider range of discharges. And that involves both greater storm flows, but also much lower base flows. And we want to deal with both those problems. And so how do you do that? You give the channel some space. As we saw in Bethany Creek, you recreate a blue-green corridor within which it can work, within which it can convey water, it can store water, it can convey sediment, it can store sediment, it can process contaminants, it can cycle nutrients. And that isn't going to make the stream like it was before the urbanization, because that's gone. Lewis and Clark aren't coming back. We're not going to go back to what these streams look like. What we are going to do is build streams that are as resilient as possible to the uncertain future and whatever that throws at it. Because streams, and I really like a lot of the urban streams I work on, like Johnson Creek, is a blue-collar creek. It's not one you'd like to live along particularly. It isn't stuffed full of salmon and caddisfly and butterflies, because it's polluted and it's ripped by stormwater, and it has to provide a lot of stormwater drainage. However, Johnson Creek can be the best Johnson Creek it can be if we give it a chance, and the ecosystem benefits we get from it will more than compensate us for the investment we make. But we have to give it a bit more space. We have to calm down its energy fluxes. We have to give it conveyance, storage, connectivity, and those will give us habitat and resilience. And those functions are interdependent, and none of them is redundant. So the more that we can give our rivers recuperative strength, adaptive capacity, the better they'll be able to continue to serve us in a very uncertain future.
All right, well, thanks for that, Colin. Janine, the tech team here have your slides up. Would you like us to pull them up so that you can speak to those a bit, just to pick up from where we dropped you off? Yeah.
Ask you to advance them
Sure.
when I'm ready. Because I thought I was done, so I deleted my clicker button. Okay, so 5 Mile Bell, you've heard several things about it now. Kind of central coast of Oregon. You can see it is right on the coast. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I used this in my talk. You saw a little inset of this. This is not actually 5 Mile Bell. This is Lytle Creek, which is an adjacent watershed. This was our reference reach that we looked at. And Lytle Creek doesn't have a single channel. It's full of willows and other native vegetation. And there are many, many channels in there that we didn't even try to map. And so in the upper left of this, you'll see the triangle. This is the stream evolution triangle, and biology is at the top. And what we're indicating by this is that this system is completely biologically controlled. It's really the vegetation that's holding this system together. Next slide. So here we are back with Paul Burns on this project, and you can see that now we're saying that this system is more geologically controlled because it's stuck in that degraded kind of 3S condition. Again, the cattle were removed, so they removed grazing. They tried to let this passively recover, and it didn't do that. And so, again, kind of, this is a project that is a very long, I can't remember how many, maybe 7 miles over 10 years. So it was done kind of phased approaches, but this is the incised condition. Next slide, please. So this is the one that caused shock and awe and horror along many people, because you go out there and what had been this kind of green pasture was open, raw soil, and we're like, oh my gosh, what has happened out here? But keep in mind, pretty much 100% of that green was reed canary grass. So essentially, we kind of went in and removed that mat of reed canary grass, stripped off that surface to expose that old kind of seed bed in there. And they had to get enough kind of below the root depth of the reed canary grass. And there is some large wood that was placed in here. And if you kind of squint your eyes and look carefully, you might see some shadows of those pilot channels that were cut. Not nearly as much wood as we're seeing in other systems. This is not a high energy system. This is an area that gets something like 90 inches of rain a year. Things grow like crazy. So there's all kinds of vegetation that came back very, very quickly. Next slide, please. And this is what the site looked at like. I kind of joked around like 3 days later. It wasn't quite 3 days later, but within the first year, just this huge vegetative response, a lot of native vegetation, like Paul said, still a little bit of reed canary grass. But we were out there in probably June. There was still water on the floodplain. It was very cold. There are a few channels out there, but the flow is essentially just kind of spread across this entire floodplain. And the great thing about that is the aquatic species, the fish, are able to get out there and feed, which is why we're seeing coho production really increase in the system. And you'll see on the triangle that we're back up in the biology corner. So that's kind of the evolution of 5 Mile Bell. And for those of you who are interested, there is a lot more information on this, I think probably on that Stage Zero information hub. But if there isn't enough information there, please feel free to reach out and I can provide some additional information. Thanks.
Well, Janine, I think, probably many of us here appreciate that extra little bit of deep dive into that one, because I would say, it's why I came back to it, because I thought, I must not understand what she's saying properly, because I think what she said is they scraped off all the vegetation, filled it in with dirt, and said, "Ta-da, we made it better." And I thought, no, I must not have got that. But I think you've confirmed that I basically did get it the first time, but it just took me a while to wrap my head around it. So
you got it. You
thank
just
you.
didn't believe it.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was. Maybe that it's. I can learn new tricks, but it's getting harder, maybe.
Well, you're probably just seeing the faces of what your faces were like when you first said, we're going to put all this material into this stream. And it's like, really? It's a bit of a different concept to wrap your head around. Well, I'm not
Because
so
you're
go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say one more thing. It was shocking because you're essentially taking some of the most erodible material on the planet and you're opening up this entire floodplain. And everyone's like, it's just all going to wash away. And it's a depositional environment. It didn't wash away.
Well, and to that point, Janine, I think everyone assumes there's grade control buried all over throughout that place. And it's not just sand all the way through.
Excellent. Well, tremendous amount of information today, really provided by you folks, experts in the field that you are working in. The presentations have really highlighted to me the interest in practitioners by just all the people that we have online today in wanting to learn more and understand more about restoration and how they can do restoration better. And I'm really looking forward to the Restoration Center, our group, the Restoration Center of Expertise, really in being committed to in helping practitioners deliver a variety of fronts, information exchange like we're doing today, training, some guidance, and providing just these support tools that you reference so easily that we just simply don't have at our hands right here, right now. And also just providing really sound technical advice on a continuum basis. This has been a really great first step for me, from my perspective, and I really look forward to the Restoration Center of Expertise really providing the future connections. And don't be surprised if we're reaching back out to you to come back and have further discussions and talks.